In this video, we will show you how to replace your front inner tie rod end on this Kia Forte Koup. This is part of your front steering and suspension, located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension's hanging. To remove the wheel, we're going to remove all 5 of our 21mm lug nuts, and then we can get the wheel off of here. Now in between your outer tie rod end and your inner tie rod end, you're going to find that you have a jam nut. To be able to loosen this, we want to hold the outer tie rod end and use a 22mm to turn this towards the inner tie rod end. We'll hold the tie rod end with a 21, 22 for the jam nut, turn that clockwise. Once you have movement from this area, we'll be making our way to our brake caliper. Now for the caliper, the first thing we need to do here is carefully push back our caliper piston, which is located inside this area. To do this, you can use a small pry bar. We'll use that pry bar directly inside of this port and pry up against the brake pad or the brake rotor, being careful not to cause any damage. We need to push that piston in. At this point, you can see that we do have movement from the caliper. Let's pause out here and make our way along the backside to remove our 2 caliper bracket bolts. Along the backside of the caliper, we'll be using a 17mm to remove each of these bolts. We'll start with the top one. Go ahead and remove that. A quick inspection, start it back in a couple threads. With that started in a couple threads, we'll continue on to fully removing the lower bolt as well. Now we'll take hold of the caliper, carefully remove it from the area, a quick inspection of the brake pads and the caliper itself. Once you confirm that looks good, go ahead and hang it aside, putting no pressure on the flex hose. Swing this along to the front and out of our way. With the caliper out of the way, we can start dislodging the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. This is typically held in place with a locking cotter pin. For that, you do want to remove the cotter pin, and it's always a good idea to replace it. You can use some cutters for this or whatever you might happen to have. Just set that aside for recycling. Use a 17mm to remove the mounting nut. A quick inspection and start it back on there, just a couple threads. Once you do have that loose, it's always a good idea to apply a little bit of penetrant in the area where the tie rod end stud goes through that steering knuckle. After you've done so, it's time to separate the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. To do this, lightly tap on the steering knuckle itself, causing vibration. The tie rod end should come down, and the nut will hold it from falling down and potentially hurting you. Continuing from here, we're going to have to unscrew the outer tie rod end from the inner tie rod end. To do this, we'll be turning this counterclockwise, and while we're turning it counterclockwise, we're going to count the amount of turns it takes to remove it from the inner tie rod end. You can tell that we're starting with the tie rod end starting face up, so we'll come around counterclockwise like I said. There's 1 turn, 2 turns, and so on. I had approximately 12 turns. Your results may vary. Go ahead and write that number down. There it is, friend. A quick inspection, and we'll set this aside. With the outer tie rod end out of the way, we're going to continue on back at that 22mm jam nut. Go ahead and remove that from the inner tie rod end. A quick inspection of that to make sure it is still reusable, set it aside. Now we can start removing the bellows boot. For the bellows boot, you'll find it's held in place with two clamps. One of them, the outer one's reusable. The inboard one is a single time use. For the outer one, it's just a squeezable clamp. Go ahead and squeeze on that with some pliers and remove it. A quick inspection to make sure that's reusable and set it aside. We'll use an angled pick to break free the bellows boot from the inner tie rod end. You can use some lubricant if necessary. Right along this area, go our way around. Now it's time for the inner clamp on the power steering rack bellows boot. For this, we're going to have to tap on this area of the clamp, break it free, remove the clamp, and then we can remove the boot from the inner tie rod end and power steering rack. To break this free, I'm just going to use a long pry bar and a hammer. It's pretty much ready to come off now. Let's reach up in here. We should be able to pull this out. Go ahead and take hold of that power steering rack bellows boot. We'll give it a little twist to break it free and pull it out and away. There it is, friend. A quick inspection, and we'll set this aside. With that out of the way, we have a clear view of the inner tie rod end. We have the ball and socket area here where the pivot point is. We need to hold on to this area and turn it counterclockwise to remove it from the power steering rack. This can be done by several different tools. You can use some long pliers if necessary, or an inner tie rod end tool. For the inner tie rod end tool I'll have to use a 14mm to tighten each one of these mounting nuts up against that joint. Now that that's broken free, we can remove our tool. Remove the inner tie rod end from the power steering rack, and there it is, friend. With the inner tie rod out of position, before we install the brand new one, we need to clean and inspect the power steering rack. First of all, we'll be paying attention to the threaded portion here right at the very end where that inner tie rod end will screw into. Make sure the threaded portion is not rusted or rotted in any way. Once you've done that, continue on making your way inboard towards that power steering rack right on the area where the bellows boot was sitting. In this area, if you see any power steering fluid, the rack seal is bad, and it's always a good idea to go ahead and replace your power steering rack. Ours is nice and dry, and it's in great condition, so let's continue on with our installation. And now we can install the inner tie rod end. When installing this, we want to have the threaded portion go into the threaded portion of the power steering rack. Go ahead and start this in and bottom it out by hand. We'll get our inner tie rod end tool in place. And now we'll tighten this up using hand tools. Never use an impact tool on something like this. Once it's bottomed out, you just need to take it a little bit further, and that should do it. Remove your inner tie rod end tool and double check to make sure everything's properly secure. Continuing on, we'll lubricate the joint area. You can use some grease right inside here, pivot around as necessary. Work that in. Once you've lubricated that, we'll also lubricate the area on the inner tie rod end where that power steering bellows boot will sit. It's time to install the power steering rack bellows boot. We'll be taking the wider portion and slide this right on over the inner tie rod end all the way onto the power steering rack. With that boot properly secured, we'll continue on with a wire tie. We'll make a small circular loop here, slide it right on over the boot. We want to bring this all the way down to where the boot connects onto the power steering rack. Once we're in the proper groove, make sure it's nice and tight. Just double check and make sure we're on the boot. To help tighten this, you can use some long nose pliers. Just take hold of it, give it a little twist, and then trim off the excess. With the inboard clamp in place, we'll continue on with the outboard side here. We want to make sure the bellows boot's sitting in the proper groove on the inner tie rod end. We'll continue on with the outboard clamp. If you're not reusing your original clamp, go ahead and use a wire tie. Just make sure it's in the right place and tight. We'll coat the threads with some anti-seize and continue on with our jam nut. Bring this about halfway down the threaded portion there. Now it's time to install our outer tie rod end. We'll start this on by hand. Once you do have it started on, you need to reinstall it the same amount of turns as it had taken to remove it originally. 1, 2, and so on. There we are. Now we'll take this, bring it over to where it connects onto that steering knuckle, pivot things as necessary so you can re-secure this together. We'll continue on with our outer tie rod end mounting nut. Just start that on. With that started on, snug it up and then torque it to 25 foot-pounds. Once you have that torqued, the next thing you need to do is pay attention to the slots that are on the mounting nut in comparison to the hole that goes through the tie rod stud. We need to make sure they're aligned so we can put the locking cotter pin through. If it's not properly aligned, continue tightening the mounting nut until the very next slot is. After that, continue on with that locking cotter pin. Just make sure we pin this over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on us while we're driving down the road. Let's make our way to our jam nut. We'll turn this counterclockwise so it bottoms out against your outer tie rod end. Now we're going to hold on to the outer tie rod end with a 21mm wrench while tightening the jam nut with a 22mm wrench. Make sure that's nice and tight. Now it's time to reinstall our brake caliper. We'll get this aligned. Start in each of our two 17mm headed mounting bolts, snug them up, and then torque those to 70 foot-pounds. Use some blue thread locker on these. One last quick inspection in this area, and we can reinstall our wheel. We'll start on all of our 21mm lug nuts and bottom them out. With the wheel back on the ground, we'll be torquing each of our 21mm lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay, friend, we've got the vehicle back together. At this point, you want to go ahead and pump up that brake pedal, take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.